Hey YouTube, Darth here. This is Yes or No, a weapon review series where I give a clear and concise answer as to what weapons you should be using in Battlefield 4. Today I'm looking at the M40A5 Bolt-Action Rifle. I'm not a huge bolt-action player for reasons I'll talk about in this video, so I put a lot of time into playing with the M40A5 to get a good sense for this weapon. But what about you? Should you be using the M40A5? Yes or no? No, and this is a really solid no on this one, folks. Like every weapon, the M40A5 has its ups and downs, but the M40A5 is a bolt action first and a mediocre bolt action second. On normal, there are very few weapons in the game that are possibly worse than the M40A5. Most secondaries are in fact better than this primary weapon. However, if you're mostly a hardcore player, this weapon is actually a great deal better and probably a yes for that mode. But before I get into the negatives about the M40A5, let's talk about what it does well. The M40A5 has one of the best rates of fire among the bolt-action sniper rifles. If you're like me and a sloppy shot, the 51 rounds per minute rate of fire will help you get a follow-up shot in quickly before your target can completely get out of the way. Only the CS5 rifle has a better rate of fire. Like the rest of the bolt-action rifles, the M40A5 does 100 maximum damage and that falls off to 59 a bit faster than some of the other rifles. At less than 12.5 meters, this will do fatal damage to unarmored targets with anything landing above the belt. Anything else and only a headshot will do. Combined with the rate of fire, this becomes a great advantage on hardcore. While not incredible among weapons in Battlefield 4, the reload time of 2.7 seconds with a bullet in the chamber and 4.8 seconds without puts the M40A5 in the upper half of the bolt-action reload speeds. It's not going to blow your mind, but it's not a huge detriment either, and for a bolt action it's relatively decent. That's it for the positives of this weapon. There are a lot of other copy and paste statistics shared by nearly every bolt action that aren't worth mentioning because they're no better or worse than anything else in this class. For example, hipfire, spread, and decrease are all nearly identical in bolt actions. So now let's talk about what makes this a crappy weapon. Compared to the other bolt-action rifles, the M40A5 has a relatively high drop-off. Now, if most of your engagements are under 300 meters, as I suspect they will be, these differences come less into play, but it is something to be aware of. It's going to make long-distance sniping particularly difficult. The M40A5 has a bullet velocity of only 520 meters per second, which makes it the second to last among the bolt actions and puts it among one of the slower weapons in the game. This isn't exactly a statistic you want on a bolt-action weapon, as it's going to greatly increase the difficulty of landing long-range and even medium-range shots. Combined with the high drop-off, this makes the M40A5 pretty unappealing as a long-range weapon. With only 5 rounds per magazine and 1 in the chamber, the M40A5 only leaves you with enough ammo for 6 shots before reloading. It's enough to get the job done in most circumstances, but it's not particularly amazing among the bolt actions, and the M40A5 is definitely the least efficacious of the rifles with similar magazine sizes. Let's just say that it's not an asset to this weapon. It's also one of the shortest range bolt actions at 2600 meters as its maximum range. But honestly, how many shots are you even going to be landing even beyond 1500 meters? Not a lot of maps have sightlines that are even that long, and if you're using the M40A5 for long-range sniping at that distance, you've got the wrong weapon. Now I also want to talk about the shortcomings of bolt actions in general. First, the statistics of bolt actions at the launch of Battlefield 4 were almost entirely inherited from Battlefield 3. In the transition, they gained some more damage to offset the loss of the chest multiplier, and a later patch tweaked the velocities upwards as the soldier move speed is also much higher. Both of those changes are related to two of the primary weaknesses of every bolt action, shots to the chest and soldier movement speeds. In Battlefield 3, every bolt action shot to the chest from 15 meters or less was a guaranteed kill. In Battlefield 4, the range got brought in to just 12.5 meters. Why the switch? Well, firstly, the chest multiplier is easier to achieve in Battlefield 4, it occupies more than just the upper chest. But that's not a weakness. What has made the bolt actions nearly pointless in close quarters is the addition of the defensive field upgrade. The defensive field upgrade is probably one of the worst concepts to make it into the game. It renders pump-action slugs, the bow, and bolt-action sniper rifles effectively useless in close quarters. Now it's true not everybody equips a defensive field upgrade, but because it's unpredictable who is using it and it affects basic gunplay, you have to assume everybody has it. Hitting headshots consistently at less than 15 meters is a pretty big ask with any single-shot weapon. Now the second thing that bolt actions suffer from is the high soldier acceleration and movement speeds in Battlefield 4. This wasn't as much of an issue when Battlefield 4 launched because the soldiers accelerated slowly and trudged around. After a couple of patches, soldier movement got way up, and Dice LA responded by tuning a number of bolt actions and DMRs upwards in the velocity to compensate. On DMRs, I think the tuning may have been enough, but given the relatively long flight times of bolt actions, I suspect it was not enough. Translation: good luck hitting anything at range that's moving relatively quickly, particularly if the player is doing the Mario. Well, this is usually the part of the series where I talk about how to control the weapon in question, except this is a bolt action, so you fire one at a time and it goes up. The M40A5 is pretty forgiving and resets almost immediately. Not a lot of control required aside from putting your sight where it needs to be. Some recommendations I would have though are pretty standard across all bolt actions. First, stand still when you're taking your shots. Otherwise they're going nowhere near where you're aiming and you're probably not going to get a follow-up if enemies are near. Second, if you're using a scope with more than 4x range, be sure to hold your breath while shooting. On PC this is accomplished with the shift key by default. Don't hold too long as your soldier will gasp and your shot will skip. Finally, depending on how far your target is away, you may wish to zero your weapon to that range. On PC this is accomplished by the V key as in Victor. I prefer to simply adjust my aim as opposed to adjusting my sights, aiming higher than my target for ones that are further away. First and foremost, when talking tactics for the M40A5, on normal, the sniper rifle is awful at long range and at short distances. So you've really got to position yourself in the 30 to 100 meter sweet spot to your targets. When your enemy gets closer than that, I'd highly recommend pulling out the secondary and making sure that it's great at the close quarters roll. The G18 was my preferred secondary for the M40A5, and I actually think the G18 makes a better primary weapon than the M40. If you're on an objective-based game mode, you're going to do your most good by being the defensive player or the supporting player. As much as it pains me, you're really not going to do much good with the M40A5 as an aggressive recon. That sounds crazy with its high rate of fire, but the gun is just too mediocre in general and downright terrible at close range to be effective in an aggressive role. Keep in mind I'm talking about normal mode here. But if you make yourself the second wave, you'll probably have a lot more luck, particularly if you can get into a protected position. On TDM, if rooftops were still a thing on maps, the M40A5 might be okay if you can get yourself into a reasonable position and stay there. However, most rooftops are now inaccessible to players and the M40A5 really loses its luster. You'll end up using your secondary more than the M40 on tight TDM maps. In all honesty, on normal, the M40A5 really is a terrible weapon and you'll find it to be lacking at just about every range. You'll underperform by having to adapt your playstyle to its demands and it simply never rises above mediocrity. But although it's a hindrance, I have to say the times when you land really lucky shots, it feels pretty awesome. However, on hardcore, this thing turns into a crazy beast mode weapon. Because every sniper rifle does very nearly the same damage outside of drop-off, equipping yourself with a fast-firing bolt action is a no-brainer. By the way, if I played exclusively on hardcore and the balance of this game were based on hardcore, the M40A5 would be a definite yes. But since we're calibrated on normal, we have to worry about drop-off, aim, and the defensive field upgrade. So it's still a no. Let's take a look at some of the meager options you have when outfitting the M40A5, which is going to sound pretty similar to every bolt action out there. Taking a look at BF4stats.com for the most popular loadouts, I found that the 6x and 8x scopes were the most popular among the community, along with the laser sight, no barrel attachment, and a pretty much universal choice with a straight pull auxiliary. So what did I end up committing to with my loadout? Well, for the sight, I actually ended up going with the JGM 4x scope. This is a little less sight than a lot of snipers prefer to bring, and I actually think this is still pretty adequate for the ranges that the M40A5 is okay in. I tend to prefer the medium range sights on the bolt actions in general because they do not have scope glint. If I'm aiming at a target, I'd prefer them not to know it ahead of time. I wouldn't recommend going any lower than the 4x as the M40A5 is really just terrible in close range. For my accessories, surprise surprise, I went with the laser sight. The M40A5 isn't great at hipfire, and even with the laser on, you're going to have to hit a lucky shot to get your hipfire in. But if you're disciplined enough about turning your laser off when aiming downrange, it doesn't hurt, particularly when your other option is nothing. On the barrel, I noticed a lot of players seem to run with nothing, but I found no real disadvantage to running with the flash hider. On automatics, I've dumped the flash hider because it affects spread decrease, but there's so much time between shots and so few shots that the spread decrease of this weapon just doesn't matter when paired with the flash hider. Just one more thing to reduce your noticeability seems like a no-brainer. Finally, for the auxiliary on the M40A5, I went with the straight pull bolt. Honestly, the bipod is so embarrassingly awful in Battlefield 4 that it's completely outclassed by the advantage of being able to not have to wait until you leave your scope to chamber the next round. I really don't know why this choice even exists on bolt-action rifles when it's pretty meaningless. What's worse is that the straight pull bolt is the linchpin that makes many of the bolt actions even worth using and doesn't unlock until many tens or dozens of kills into the weapon. And why would no auxiliary even be an option? In reality, this class of customization feels like a forgotten feature of Battlefield 4. At least by the developers. Earlier I talked about how amazing the M40A5 is when it's on hardcore, and it is a great weapon for hardcore only. But unfortunately the game isn't balanced around hardcore and the M40A5 is absolutely terrible on normal. I've always wondered if hardcore has some lessons to teach about bolt actions for normal mode. I definitely wouldn't translate their power 1-to-1, but they definitely seem like much more of a top tier option on hardcore. As for the M40A5, it's a mediocre bolt action, it's still pretty terrible in normal, and is a definite no. Honestly, if you're looking for better rifles to turn to on normal, I'm a big fan of the JNG90. I feel like it's reliable in many ways that the M40A5 is not. It's better at range too. If you're not the kind to want to deal with the problems of bolt actions, the SKS may also be a good contender for your primary slot. Unlike the bolts, the SKS is a DMR that opens up additional class options. It's also far better in a pinch than any bolt action and doesn't require strict headshots. That's it for this episode of Yes or No. I'm not the best sniper in the world, so if there's something you think I missed about the M40A5, or if you have a different take, please let me know in the comments below. If there's a particular weapon you'd like to see reviewed on this series, leave a comment below indicating which weapon. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.